from the military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, to talk about military doctrine, military history, and military leaders, and how we can take those and use them in our business lives to make our professional lives, to make our businesses run better, to be better leaders, and all around, hopefully use this vast resource of knowledge and experience to improve our lives. So I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different today than I usually do. And I just realized here we go. Okay. Let's see. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about one of the sort of fundamental aspects of the military and how we might use this to improve our businesses. So to give you a little bit of background, so in the post-World War II era, so a huge number of people had been in the U.S. military, mostly men, although there were women in the military. In fact, we saw the WACs, the Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. That was for the Navy. There was also there were female Marines, and I believe there were female Coast Guardsmen as well. After World War II, much of what these people learned in military training, and for that matter in military service, whether it was support or combat service, they took to the civilian world. And as a result, America became very successful at building, for example, large construction projects all over the world. Companies tended to operate on very structured organizational plans. There were clear lines of reporting, clear lines of communication, etc. We've seen, I think, a trend away from that recently, maybe in the last 10 years, maybe more, where civilian organizations, they've flattened out their hierarchies, gotten rid of a lot of middle managers and such. That has certainly helped companies operate more cost efficiently, but I'm not sure it's 100% clear that it's created an overall better environment, because I think some of the elements of how the military operates are still missing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, as I oftentimes do. And we're going to talk about two things here today. First of all, I want to talk about U.S. Army ranks, and because that will be the precursor then to understanding how the Army organizes itself. So, oops, nope. Got something backwards there. Okay, so in fact, all the branches of the military are, in terms of ranks, or what used to be called rates and ranks, are globally, if you will, organized the same way. So you have the enlisted. They used to be called rates. Now they call all of them ranks. So you have enlisted. You have what are called warrant officers. And then you have what in this graphic they're calling just officers, but they are actually what are called commissioned officers. Now, I'm going to talk historically for just a moment. the difference between the three is enlisted personnel is essentially signed a contract to be in the military for a certain period of time. Warrant officers had what was called a warrant, which was a particular kind of document that that gave them their status in the military, that was different than a commissioned officer. So a commissioned officer had the most status. And the difference between the three are, and now, by the way, warrant officers also carry a commission. So there's sort of there's been quite a bit of blurring among the categories. The enlisted ranks are sort of the ones who actually do the work, so to speak. Okay, so whether it's fighting, whether it's maintenance, whether it's preparing food, whatever, the enlisted personnel perform those duties. Warrant officers are, generally speaking, technical specialists. So, for example, in the Korean War, if you've ever watched the TV show MASH, so oftentimes the helicopter pilots who flew the wounded to the MASH units were warrant officers. They weren't general pilots; those were commissioned officers. They were specialists in that type of airborne transport, if you will. Okay, and then commissioned officers are the leadership core, or the leadership part of the personnel in the military. Okay, and in the Army, the entry, if you will, enlisted rank is private. And then you have a PFC, a private first class. You have a specialist. It has this very different badge than all the rest. And then you go. Those are like I said, kind of the entry level. And then you have what are called non-commissioned officers, or NCOs. So those are corporal, sergeant, and sergeants in the Army, anyway. And then you have what are called senior non-commissioned officers, or SNCOs. And that starts with staff sergeant, sergeant first class, and sergeant major. They're the same level. It's just they do different things. One is more concerned with personnel. The other is more concerned with operations. Same with a first sergeant and a sergeant major. First sergeant is dealing more personnel issues. Sergeant major is more sort of leadership type issues. And then you have what's called a command master sergeant and sergeant major of the Army. So the most senior enlisted person in the Army is the sergeant major of the Army. Okay, there's only one of them. Okay, and then warrant officers, you basically have warrant officer 1 through 5, although I think the warrant officer 5 is not being used these days. I could be wrong about that. All right, and then commissioned officers, typically you start out your commissioned officer career as a second lieutenant. That's that gold bar there. And then you become a first lieutenant, a captain, a major, a lieutenant colonel, and then a colonel, or what's sometimes called a full bird colonel, that's to distinguish it from a lieutenant colonel. So you have what are called junior officers, the first, second and first lieutenant and captain, and then you have what are known as field grade officers, major, a lieutenant colonel, and colonel. And then you have what are known as general officers, or flag officers. I was having this discussion with somebody last week, and they said, well, flag officer, what's a flag officer? So historically, when someone was a general or an admiral, if you were in the Navy, a flag was flown to designate that he was on a post or on a ship, and that flag would, depending on what branch of the service he was in, the flag would be a particular color, and then the stars would be some sort of contrasting color. Okay, and so in the Army, the lowest grade of general officer is a brigadier general. The second is a major general. And the third, that's 2 stars. And then 3 stars is a lieutenant general, and 4 stars is a general. Now, there is technically such a thing as a 5-star general. There haven't been any 5-star generals in a long, long time. It was a rank created during World War II because in England, for example, there was a rank known as a field marshal, which was one rank above a full general. And there was it created the situation where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was reporting to General Eisenhower, so a 5-star, nominally anyway, was reporting to a 4-star, and that didn't sit well with the public, and so a 5-star general was created. Eisenhower was a 5-star general, so was George Marshall. I believe at one point Bradley was also elevated to 5 stars, and there were some 5-star admirals as well, which maybe we'll talk about another time. And again, another historical note is the reason the United States didn't use the rank field marshal was it sounded too European, too sort of monarchistic. And so, general of the army or 5-star general sounded more, kind of small d democratic. Okay, so these are the various ranks. And the reason that's important is because as we look at the Army organizational chart, you're going to see that as the units get larger, the leadership of that unit gets more senior. Okay, so let's now go to the next one. Hopefully this will be big enough to see. Well, this is kind of small. Okay, well, so what you have here is a basic organizational chart. This right here is the basic Army unit, large unit anyway, is what's known as a division. Okay. So, and that's really what we're going to focus on. I'll talk briefly about these other designations up here, but it's really how a division is built that I think is most applicable for our discussion. So, the smallest unit in the Army is known as a fire team, and it's a group of 4 soldiers. By the way, this really relates to an infantry division. So an artillery unit, cavalry, they're organized differently. I'm dealing here with infantry. So a fire team, generally speaking, is made up of 4 soldiers. And to go back for a moment, it would be led by either a corporal or sometimes a sergeant. That's why these 2 enlisted ranks have the status of a non-commissioned officer, because they are in a leadership position. Okay, the other members of the fire team are going to be privates and PFCs. There could be another corporal in the fire team as well, who's not in a leadership position. Okay, so you've got, and it's a very tight knit unit, trains together, all that kind of stuff. Okay, now if you put 2 fire teams together, you get what's called a squad. So a squad has 9 soldiers in it, and it's generally led by It's generally led by a staff sergeant. I want to make sure I got the right thing. A staff sergeant, going back to this, is the entry-level senior non-commissioned officer. Okay, but you see at these very small unit level, it's all enlisted people. Okay, now the next group up then is a platoon, and a platoon is usually made up of several squads. Okay, and it's typically a few dozen soldiers. So let's say you have 4 squads, so that's about 36 soldiers plus the platoon leadership. So you can see it's about 3 and a half, 4 dozen soldiers. Okay. And a platoon is going to be commanded by a lieutenant, generally speaking. Could be a second lieutenant, could be a first lieutenant. It really, it just depends on, who is the personnel available, what is the level of experience of the personnel. So, if you have a very experienced second lieutenant, he might have a platoon, or if it's a combat situation, and let's say that the platoon commander was a first lieutenant, and he was wounded or killed, so then his number two may be a second lieutenant, and he would take over the platoon. Okay. Now, next up then from a platoon is a company. And a company is, generally speaking, 3 to 4 platoons. And you have about 200 soldiers in a company. So let's say a platoon is 40, 45. So you can see 3 times that, 135, 490, plus the company leadership now. Okay, that's where you get to about 200 soldiers. Okay, and the company is, generally speaking, commanded by a captain. Okay, going back to the ranks here for a minute. Now you see we're into the commissioned officer ranks. So a platoon might be a second or more likely a first lieutenant. Company is going to be led by a captain. Okay, and then from a company you go up to a battalion, and a battalion, generally speaking, is 3 to 5 companies. Okay, so it might be as many as 1,000 soldiers in a battalion. Okay, so again, a company is about 200, so 4 companies in a battalion would be about 800. Okay, and 5 would be 1,000, again, plus the battalion leadership. Okay, so a battalion is already now a pretty good sized unit, typically led by a lieutenant colonel. Okay, and you could again, in an extraordinary situation, you might have a battalion who is taken over by a colonel, or you might have the major may be the executive officer in a battalion. The battalion commander is killed or wounded, and so the major could take over. So generally speaking, one grade up or down is possible, although usually it'll be a lieutenant colonel. Okay, then next, now, for those of you who are familiar with World War II movies, you'll see in this case, because this is how the Army is currently organized, we go from a battalion to a brigade. Okay, and you're saying, wait a minute, what happened to a regiment? So regiments, for the most part, have gone away in both the Army and the Marine Corps. Sometimes they exist for certain administrative purposes, but generally speaking, the way things are organized now is you take a few battalions, and that forms a brigade. Okay, and a brigade could be anywhere from about 1,500 to say 3,000, even 5,000 soldiers. So 2 to 3 battalions, and a brigade typically will be commanded by a colonel, or it could be commanded by a brigadier general, brigadier general, right? So it depends on what the situation is. Okay, and then you put 3 or 4 brigades together, and now you have, you could have anywhere from, say, I don't know, 10 to 15,000 soldiers, and you have a division. Typically, a division is headed up by a major general, a 2-star general. And I want to go back and note something. So I remember talking to my dad about this, and I said, wait a minute, Dad, a major outranks a lieutenant, but how does a lieutenant general outrank a major general? That made no sense to me. And my dad explained to me that originally the 2-star general was a sergeant major general. And of course, a lieutenant outranks a sergeant major. And then eventually they dropped the sergeant part of a major general, and he was just a major general. So, I've never verified that, but it came from my dad. So I'm going with it in his honor, right? All right. So what this structure does, okay, and then by the way, above this, so you have what are called corps. So 2 to 5 divisions make a corps that would generally be led by a lieutenant general. And then you have a field army or an army, could be anywhere from 2 to 5 corps, and that would be led by a full general. Okay. And then, above field army, you have army group, and these days, so an army group in World War II was typically led by a 5-star general. I take that back. Omar Bradley was a group general. He was a 4-star when he led the group. But then you had what they now call a region general. So Eisenhower was the commanding general of SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Okay, and he was a theater commander, really. He was the European theater commander, and so he was a 5-star general. But we're going to stick with the division level. So why is it organized this way? Well, you can see that generally speaking, the leader in any of these groups has direct reports of around 3 to 4 to maybe 5 people. Okay, so if you're the leader, if you're a corporal leading a fire team, you have 3 people that you're in charge of. Okay, and if you're leading a squad, so you have basically 2 fire team leaders that report to you. If you're the leader of a platoon, so you're going to have a few squads, 3 to 5. So you're going to have 3 to 5 people who are reporting to you. Now, by the way, once you get up to the platoon and certainly the company level, you're going to have other advisors who are supporting you. But in terms of your direct reports, the what's called the chain of command, so 3 to 4, maybe 5 companies. 3 to 4, maybe 5 platoons in a company. So you have 3 to 5 direct reports. And the same is true of the battalion, and the same is true of the brigade, and even up to the division. Okay. So there's clear demarcation lines, and that's important because it's not just a matter of an order descending from divisional leadership to the brigade leadership, to brigade leadership, to battalion leadership, etc. It's also a matter of information funneling back up. Okay, so information from the fire team, it could be of an intelligence nature. It could be information about the success or lack thereof of a particular operation. May move from the fire team to the squad to the platoon. Okay, or it may be that the platoon leader is out there in the field and he's observing what's happening with the fire teams and the squads. Okay, and he reports that information up to company, and company reports it to battalion, who reports it to brigade, who reports it to division. Now you see these, I don't know if you can see these lines here, they're kind of small. Sometimes there will be direct communication between a company and division, or a company and battalion, but in terms of a strict chain of command, it would flow fire team, squad, platoon, and then company, battalion, brigade, and then up to division. Okay, so I've been trying to remember the book where I read this, and I think it's Who Stole My Cheese. It's kind of a corny name for a book, but they talk about how to effectively lead in a business, you want to have a limited number of direct reports. Okay, so if too many people are reporting to a leader in business, it becomes very difficult to lead and manage all of those people. And it also makes it difficult for there to be the proper funneling of information up and back down the chain of command. And so by dividing things up this way, okay, you have a much cleaner and clearer channels of communication. Okay, and I'm sure you can appreciate how important that is in combat situation or in the military, but it's equally important in business. We need that free flow of information. So let's just take a retail store. So our fire team would be composed of the salespeople on the floor. Okay, and there may be depending on the hours that the store operates, so-called two or maybe there's 3 fire teams, and they kind of overlap during the day, so the store can stay open maybe 16 hours a day, right? So those fire teams, maybe you wouldn't have a squad in that case, but they kind of form a platoon for that store, right? And so hopefully each of those fire teams of retail clerks or retail salespeople are passing information up to the platoon leader. That may be the supervisor or the manager for the store, okay? And that manager would hopefully then be passing that information up to, maybe there's a district supervisor who's in charge of 3 to 4, maybe 5 stores in his or her district, and on up to battalion, which might be a regional leader. Brigade might be an entire state or an entire region of the country, and division in this case might be like the company headquarters, if you will. Okay, and what you can see is, while it looks like it's very hierarchical, it's really happening on 3 levels. So there's division, which is sort of the headquarters. There's the mid-level, and then there's the frontline people. And that really gives, again, a clear demarcation of responsibilities, but it also helps people understand, okay, who do I need to pass information up to? Who should I be taking direction from? And that can be very useful, okay? It can be very confusing if there's not a clear chain of command. So we don't think of business as being a command type function, but indeed, we think of leadership. So in going back to our ranks, I once heard someone talk about the difference between what non-commissioned officers and senior non-commissioned officers do and and what commissioned officers do is NCOs and SNCOs lead, commissioned officers command. Okay, and there's a big difference between the two. Okay, so we talk about the leadership of commissioned officers, but it's much more leadership in terms of, this is what we're going to do, this is when we're going to do it. This is typically they won't designate how, except for in the very global way. Okay, and then it's left to the NCOs and the SNCOs to actually lead the operations, because again, these with the exception of the platoon, are all led by NCOs and SNCOs. And by the way, sometimes a platoon will end up being led by an SNCO as well, if the commissioned officer, commander, and executive, they don't really call it executive officer, but the number 2 platoon leader are both wounded or killed. A platoon can easily end up being led by a senior non-commissioned officer. Okay, so we talk about leadership and we talk about command. Okay, and that's a good way to break down how we think about our businesses as well, because our frontline people are much better off, are in a much better position to really know how tactically to advance the mission. Okay, so if we as more sort of commissioned officer type leaders, command leaders. I use that advisedly because we don't want to be commanding people in the sense of that word. But if we set the objectives, okay, our frontline people are in a much better position to know how to execute those objectives because they're coming in contact with the public, with our customers, with our clients on a regular basis. So that's the key thing here, and that's the sort of takeaway that I would have you get from today's show. So there we go. That's the Army organizational plan and how we can use it in our businesses. And that's our show for today. So, like I said, a little bit different, and hopefully it made some good sense. I'd be curious to know. I do have another show like this planned for I don't know, a couple, 3-4 weeks from now, looking at how the military organizes itself and how we can use that to make decisions about our own businesses. So would love to hear your input. And so that wraps it up for today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, will be my show, People Making Money. And I'll be talking with Kelsey and Aaron Holtzman, and we'll be talking about entrepreneurship and marriage. And so I really encourage you to tune in for that show. I think you will find it quite fascinating. And then next week on Monday, 10 a.m., the next episode of Trust and Estates Weekly. And then, of course, 7 days from today will be the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and signing off. Marie, darling, you are my belle. All the best, folks.